Hello, everyone. Hi. Happy Friday. I think we're live. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Happy Friday. Welcome back to Testkube's office hours, where we open our virtual office doors to you. I'm Ale. I'm the developer advocate at Testkube. And today we'll be talking about performing asynchronous testing in Kubernetes. If you are new here, Testkube is a Kubernetes native testing framework for testers and developers that helps you orchestrate, execute, and display your tests and test results for your apps in Kubernetes. And if you're specifically new to Testkube's office hours, this is a space where we like to have these bi-weekly conversations where we talk about different testing practices or different testing tools and specifically how to implement them in the Kubernetes environment with Testkube. So today's agenda will cover very briefly. Oh, sorry, I didn't show it to you. I'm just going off. Today's agenda will cover very briefly what the concept of asynchronous testing is, what it entails, what are some of the techniques when we want to, or the approaches that we can take when we want to implement asynchronous testing in Kubernetes specifically. And of course, what the approach that you can take with Testkube is by using Testkube's test triggers. We'll also cover what test triggers are. Then obviously, feel free to ask any questions at the end or any time during the live stream. Very happy to chat with anyone that's interested. Okay, so we'll get started with the first part of this short talk, which is what is asynchronous testing, and just go straight into it. So what is asynchronous testing? Simply put, asynchronous testing refers to testing our application based on different events, right? Situations or triggers without the need to do these manually and go on the test and actually press just run test for me. You won't, ideally with asynchronous testing, you wouldn't have to do any of this. In Kubernetes specifically, this means that you should be able to trigger tests based on different Kubernetes events. Let's say a deployment, a job, an event, changes in your configuration, in your config map, for example, or after certain specific events. That simply put, just asynchronous testing means that you can go on with your day without having to worry about synchronously testing, which is actually triggering the test manually yourself. So let's talk about some of the challenges that come with trying to implement this practice into Kubernetes environment. Mainly the fact of introducing a non-deterministic behavior makes it very difficult to predict when a particular action will complete or when a specific event will be triggered. When we're talking about Kubernetes specifically, there's also, I think the main one is that it's very complex. Kubernetes itself adds complexity. So Kubernetes applications will often involve very complicated workflows with multiple steps. So testing each step manually can be very time consuming, very subject to errors, and actually figuring out how to actually implement something that works asynchronously or automated can be very difficult. There's also scalability issues since Kubernetes applications can scale dynamically, and this adds to the whole complexity of testing asynchronous specifically, but also in general. So a way to target these challenges is through different techniques that you probably tried or you probably heard about. It can be implementing through your CI/CD pipeline. So by implementing automated testing with, leveraging tools like Jenkins or Travis AI or GitLab to help you orchestrate your testing processes. There's also mucking and stubbing, where you stimulate external services or components that are involved in asynchronous communication. So you can isolate the component being tested and control the behavior of external dependencies. You may also use a service mesh to manage and monitor communication between microservices, and this can help you configure asynchronous testing workflows. And of course, there's just following Kubernetes. There's just following chaos engineering practices to proactively test how your application's response to failures and delays. But although these techniques can simplify or significantly improve asynchronous testing in Kubernetes, they may still require a lot of manual intervention, right? There's a lot of work to set these up and actually make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. So that brings us to Testkube's test triggers. So what are Testkube's test triggers? Testkube allows you to automate running tests and test suites, group tests, by defining triggers on certain events for various Kubernetes resources. So simply put, a trigger defines an action which will be executed for a given execution when a certain event on a specific resource occurs having a given concurrency policy. So for example, we could define a test trigger which runs a test when a config map gets modified, or when our application goes through a new deployment, for example. So how do they work? I included the image. I don't know if you'll be able to see it because it's a little small, at least on my end. But Testkube uses informers. So this way you watch Kubernetes resources and register handlers on certain actions of the Kubernetes resource that you're watching, right? Informers are a reliable, scalable, and fault-tolerant Kubernetes concept where each informer registers handlers with the Kubernetes API and gets notified by Kubernetes on each event on the watched resources. So here's where I'm telling you that it's so valuable to actually leverage Kubernetes resources and capabilities. And that's what we try to do with Testkube. So actually use everything we can to make testing better, but everything that Kubernetes already brings. We don't even need to add anything extra. It's just using what Kubernetes is already offering us. So I'm going to show you how that works and what that looks like with Testkube. We're going to head over to cloud.testkube.io, sign in, and then just get started. Let me just connect and handle my screen. I hope that you'll be able to see it. So I'm going to share the documentation with you guys where you can check everything. You can reach it through there. And at the same time, I'm going to share my screen where we're going to actually take a look at the documentation. Okay, I think it's this one. I have a mess going on over here. Okay, there you go. So here's our Testkube's documentation where you can navigate to concepts and then find all the information on your triggers, how they work, how they're built, the architecture, a little bit more on informers, and just anything you need to know about test triggers. So we go over here, and it's pretty straightforward how you can implement them. You can also take a look at what is a Testkube test trigger, what's a custom resource definition model, how they're built, and this different resource conditions that you can use to trigger your tests. So here are the supported values for different resources that you can use to trigger events. You can do it based on your pods deployment, a service, an ingress, an event, or changes in your config map, like I said. And the action that this can trigger is running a test or a test suite whenever some of these resources are created, modified, or deleted. And as I said before, you can do it for tests or test suites, which are a group of tests. Then over here, we can see the example that I was showing you guys. This is how a test trigger is defined. Let's take a look at how that looks like on Testkube. So we'll head over to cloud.testkube.io. I think you can still see my screen if I do that, right? Yeah. Okay. So I have a bunch of tests over here. Let's assume that I want to run or trigger a test suite to run whenever my application undergoes a new deployment. So we're going to kind of add that scenario out. So we're going to head over here to the lightning icon, which is test triggers. Oh, before that, I'm going to show you the test suite that I have. Let's say that I want to run this one. No, I'm going to run this one. Load testing suite, where we can see that whenever there's a new deployment in my app, all of these tests run within this test suite. So ideally, you would want this to happen. Let's say that we run health checks, and ideally, you'd want this to happen without you having to manually trigger it. So every time I make a new deployment or there's a change in my pod or my cluster, Testkube can identify that and detect that there's some testing to be done, just to make sure that everything works great after the event. So we're going to go over here to triggers. And then what you can do over here is create a new trigger. So let's say that we say new deployment. And then over here in Kubernetes resource, let's say that we say whenever there's a new deployment, right? Then you can add a resource identifier. And this is where you will, for example, call your app. And you can say when there's a new deployment or the deployment is modified. So when that happens, Testkube action will be to run a test suite. And you can call it over here. It was called load. It was called by name here. There we go. And then load testing. This is the one, right? So then we created, and then we make a new deployment. So let's trigger that. But first, let's look at what our definition looks like. So this is, you can edit this on the go, make any changes, add new conditions as well. Change the action as well. Just save, but we're going to leave it like that. And then we can take a look at the definition. So as we can see in the definition, we have a test trigger called new deployment on our Testkube namespace that's going to act based on a deployment resource on our app whenever it's modified. And what's it going to do? It's going to run a test suite called load testing that we already have there. So that's